Imagine you're a head of government. The most powerful economy in the world has slapped tariffs on your steel, your aluminum, your cars, and your lumber. Tens of thousands of your workers have already lost their jobs. The clock is ticking on a treaty review that could rewrite a trillion-dollar trading relationship in a matter of weeks. The pressure to settle, to take any deal, to claim a win, to do something, is overwhelming. And then the Prime Minister of Canada looks into a camera and says, no. On April 27th, in a CBC interview that most American outlets barely covered, Mark Carney told the country he is not going to chase what he called a small deal with Donald Trump. He said the whole tariff dispute could be wrapped up in roughly 10 days if Washington had the bandwidth and the inclination. And then, in the same breath, he said something that should have been the headline everywhere. The countries who rushed into deals with the United States this past year are, in private, not happy with what they got. That isn't a complaint, that's a strategy. And almost no one is breaking down what's actually happening underneath it. So that's what we're going to do today. Welcome back to the channel. On this program, we don't do outrage, we don't do team sports, and we don't do conspiracy theories. We do structural analysis, what the documented record actually shows, what the institutional incentives actually are, and what the players involved are actually optimizing for. Today, we're decoding one of the most consequential trade standoffs of the decade, Canada versus the United States, with the July 1st CUSMA review breathing down both their necks. Let's get into it. Let's start with what almost nobody is telling you. The mainstream framing of this story is Canada and the US are stuck on tariffs. That framing is wrong. It is not stuck. It is being deliberately paced by both sides for reasons that have very little to do with tariffs themselves. To understand what Carney is actually doing, you have to go back to July 1st, 2020. That's the day the trade pact, known in the United States as USMCA, in Canada as CUSMA, entered into force. Buried inside that treaty was something called a sunset clause. It was, ironically, proposed by the first Trump administration. The clause says this: every 6 years, all three countries, the United States, Mexico, and Canada, must formally affirm that they want the deal to continue. If even one party doesn't, the agreement doesn't immediately die. It shifts into a different mode. Annual reviews, every year, for the remaining 10 years of its lifespan, until 2036. That mechanism is the entire game. Because what it means in practice is this: the country that wants to keep renegotiating has a permanent lever. The country that wants stability has to keep showing up to the table, year after year, defending what it already has. Trump's first administration designed a deal that, if any party gets cold feet at the 6-year mark, locks all three countries into a decade of rolling pressure. And that 6-year mark is July 1st, 2026, about 9 weeks from today. Now layer in the second piece of context the headlines miss. Last fall, by most credible accounts, Canada and the United States were close to a deal on sectoral tariffs, the kind of deal Carney is now refusing to chase. The framework was beginning to take shape. And then, in October, the government of Ontario aired a television advertisement on American networks featuring a clip of Ronald Reagan explaining how tariffs hurt American consumers. Trump took it personally. He cut off official talks. The deal evaporated. That is not a footnote. That is the moment the entire dynamic flipped. Because before October, Canada was the country trying to extract relief. After October, Canada became the country forced to wait, and to watch what happened to everyone else who didn't. So when Carney now says he's not going to rush, he is making a calculation rooted in something very specific. He has watched the United Kingdom sign a deal that left tariffs in place. He has watched Japan sign a deal that left tariffs in place. He has watched the European Union sign a deal that left tariffs in place. And he has done the math on what those deals actually delivered versus what they cost. That math is the structural reality every analyst at Brookings, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies has been quietly tracking for months. And it's the reality Ottawa is now playing for. Here's the evidence panel discussions on cable news will never put side by side. First, the cost of waiting for Canada is real, but not catastrophic. Canadian manufacturing has shed roughly 52,000 jobs over the last 12 months, the bulk of them in Ontario. Aluminum output was down nearly 20% year over year in December. Wood products down 8%. Steel mills and ferroalloy production down 4%. These are serious numbers. They are also numbers that have not, yet, pushed Canada into recession. Ottawa's Spring Economic Update, released this week, projects 2% growth for the coming year and a federal deficit $11 billion smaller than what was forecast in November. Higher oil prices from the Iran war are part of that story, but so is something else: Canadian exports to non-US economies rose 17% year over year in the 12 months ending in January. Canada is, quietly and without fanfare, diversifying. Second, the value of the deals other countries signed is, in Carney's own characterization, not worth the paper they were written on. That's a strong claim. Is it true? Look at the structure. The UK deal, the Japan deal, the EU framework, every one of them retained meaningful tariffs on imports into the United States. None of them ended the tariff regime, they simply set a ceiling. And in some cases, that ceiling came with new commitments, purchases, investments, structural concessions that bought relief at a price most analysts now estimate is higher than the tariffs themselves would have been over a 2-year horizon. Third, and this is where it gets significant, Canada's leverage isn't symmetrical, but it's also not what most commentators think it is. Pre-tariff, roughly 76% of Canada's exports went to the United States, while only 17% of US exports came to Canada. On paper, that looks like a lopsided dependency. But dig into the composition. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of fertilizer. Canada supplies critical minerals, uranium, electricity into multiple American grids, and a substantial share of the natural gas that heats the American Northeast. With the Strait of Hormuz closed and global commodity supply chains under strain, that leverage is not theoretical, it is structural. Steve Verheuel, Canada's former chief trade negotiator, has pointed this out explicitly. The Iran war made Canadian commodities more, not less, valuable. Fourth, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in February that Trump's broadest tariff authority, the use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, was unconstitutional. The administration is now scrambling to refund roughly $166 billion in collected tariffs, and has fallen back on Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, which caps tariffs at 10% and lasts only 150 days. That is a much weaker legal foundation than what was in place a year ago. Every additional month Carney waits is another month the legal scaffolding underneath Trump's tariff regime continues to thin. This isn't spin, these are documented facts. When job losses, treaty mechanics, energy leverage, and Supreme Court rulings all point in the same direction, that's not coincidence, that's a pattern. And the pattern says something specific. Carney is not delaying because he can't move. He's delaying because structurally, time is on his side. Now let's ask the question that matters. Who actually benefits from where this stands today, and who is paying the cost? The obvious headline answer is that Canadian manufacturing workers in Ontario and Quebec, particularly in steel, aluminum, and auto parts, are bearing the immediate pain. That is true. But it is not the full picture. Within Canada, that pain is highly regional. Ontario and Quebec face effective tariff exposure above 6%. Newfoundland, Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, all under 1%. The tariffs have created winners and losers inside Canada, and Carney's political coalition has to manage both. On the American side, the obvious beneficiary is supposed to be U.S. domestic manufacturing. But look at the USTR's Section 232 hearings late last year. Witness after witness, almond producers, soybean associations, fresh produce distributors, Blue Diamond, the American Soybean Association, testified against the tariffs. They warned that retaliation puts U.S. farmers in the crosshairs and that lost access to the Canadian and Mexican markets threatens entire family farm economies. That is not a fringe lobby, that is the agricultural backbone of the Republican electoral coalition speaking on the public record. Now look at who is genuinely benefiting. The U.S. aluminum tariffs were designed to revive American smelters. The capacity isn't there. American producers cannot replace Canadian aluminum in the volumes the U.S. economy demands. So instead, what's happened is that aluminum prices in the United States have risen. Foreign buyers are paying most of the tariff cost, and Canadian aluminum exports have begun reorienting. Canadian shipments to the Netherlands and Italy nearly tripled in 2025. The economic substitution that tariffs were supposed to create has not happened. The substitution that has actually occurred is geographic. Canadian raw materials are finding new buyers, and that process, once underway, is very hard to reverse. Then there are the political stakeholders Washington and Ottawa rarely acknowledge openly. The U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer has been threatening enforcement action over Canadian provinces pulling American liquor from government stores. Ontario and Quebec, which together represent about 60% of the Canadian population, are holding the line. That isn't just protest. It's coordinated subnational pressure. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick keeps reviving the dairy supply management complaint, which has been a Washington grievance for 30 years. The U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, has publicly stated there have been no substantive talks since October. And then, behind all of it, there is the actor who almost never appears on cable news, the integrated North American supply chain itself. American auto plants in Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee are physically dependent on parts that cross the Canadian border multiple times before final assembly. Forcing that integration apart has costs that don't show up in tariff revenue figures, but do show up in consumer prices, in delayed inventories, and in midterm election poll numbers. The quiet players shaping this outcome are not in the briefing rooms. They are in the boardrooms, and they are talking to congressional staffers in both parties. So ask yourself, who actually wants a deal, and on what terms? It's not as obvious as the headlines suggest. Let's get concrete. 3 scenarios, 3 sets of triggers to watch. The base case. The CUSMA review formally opens on July 1st. The US and Mexico begin official bilateral negotiations in late May. Canada keeps its talks technical and informal until the US side signals genuine movement on sectoral tariffs, particularly on steel, aluminum, and autos. Canada's trade minister has already said publicly that Ottawa will get to the negotiating table when, and only when, the outline of an acceptable deal is attainable. Under this scenario, the July 1st date functions the way Canada's chief negotiator Janice Charette has described it, as a milestone, not a hard deadline. Some issues get resolved by midsummer. Others, supply management, digital services rules, softwood lumber, drag into 2027. The core CUSMA framework holds. This is the most likely outcome. The breakdown case. Trump signals the U.S. does not intend to extend CUSMA for the full 16-year renewal. That triggers the annual review mechanism, 10 years of rolling pressure. He escalates Section 122 tariffs from 10 to 15% on goods not covered by CUSMA. Canada retaliates surgically, targeting politically sensitive U.S. exports. This scenario gets significantly worse if Ottawa removes its remaining counter-tariff remissions on steel, currently set to expire January 31st of next year. Watch for 2 specific signals: whether the USTR's June 1st report to Congress recommends extension or non-renewal, and whether Trump publicly attaches non-trade demands, migration, fentanyl, defense spending, to the trade file. If both happen, we are in the breakdown. The breakthrough. The U.S. Supreme Court, having already gutted Trump's broadest tariff authority in February, takes another case that further constrains executive trade powers. Combined with mounting U.S. midterm election pressure from agricultural states, the administration accepts a narrower, sector-by-sector framework that preserves CUSMA's tariff-free core. Carney signs. He claims the win, which, given his current positioning, he can plausibly do. This is the least likely scenario in the next 90 days, but it is not impossible. The trigger to watch above all others: whether Carney and Trump sit down face-to-face before July 1st. If they do, a breakthrough becomes thinkable. If they don't, the default path runs through the base case or the breakdown. Now, to be fair, the case against Carney's slow walk is not a crazy position, and we should take it seriously. Critics, and there are many, including within his own coalition, argue something like this: every month Carney waits, Canadian manufacturing bleeds. 52,000 jobs is not a statistic, it's 52,000 families. Aluminum smelters in Quebec, steel mills in Hamilton, auto parts plants in Windsor. These are real communities under real strain. Canada, the argument goes, does not have the luxury of waiting for American politics to come around. The midterms are not until November. The Supreme Court might or might not rule again in Canada's favor. Meanwhile, the damage compounds. A small deal that locks in tariff relief on steel and autos right now, even if imperfect, is worth more than a hypothetical perfect deal that arrives in 2027, by which time large parts of the affected industries may not exist. Here's what that argument gets right. The cost of patience is not zero. Carney is making a bet. If he loses it, if the U.S. economy outruns the legal and political pressures Ottawa is counting on, Canadian workers will pay the price for his strategic patience. That risk is real, and treating it as anything else would be intellectually dishonest. But here's where the critique falls short. The premise of the criticism is that signing a small deal would actually deliver relief. The structural evidence, looking across the UK, Japan, and EU agreements, is that it doesn't. It locks in the existing tariff regime as a floor, not a ceiling. Once you sign, you've validated the framework. Once you've validated the framework, every future negotiation starts from a worse baseline. That is the trap Carney is refusing to walk into. There is also a deeper point. Canada's old strategy, what Carney himself has described as a relationship of steady, increasing integration with the United States, is over. Whether Ottawa likes it or not, the next 10 years of North American trade will be governed by rolling reviews and continuous renegotiation. That isn't a temporary aberration. That is the new structural reality. In that reality, the worst possible move is to teach Washington that you'll sign anything to make the pressure stop. Patience in this environment is not weakness. It is one of the few sources of leverage a smaller economy actually has. So the critique is right that waiting has costs, but it is wrong that signing now would lower them. This isn't abstract. If you're watching from Canada, what happens in the next 90 days will show up in your life in specific ways. If you live in Hamilton, Sault Ste. Marie, Windsor, Saguenay, or any community built around steel, aluminum, or auto manufacturing, the question of whether Ottawa holds the line or settles for a small deal will determine whether the federal supports, extended employment insurance, the Strategic Response Fund, the work-sharing grants Carney announced last fall, keep flowing or get scaled back. If you're a home buyer or a renter, Ottawa's Build Canada Homes program is now legally required to prioritize Canadian lumber on contracts above $250,000, which means the softwood lumber file directly affects construction costs in your neighborhood. If you're an American watching from Ohio, Michigan, or Iowa, your stakes are different but real. The aluminum that goes into your beer cans, the steel that frames your house, the Canadian crude that refines into your gasoline, the potash that feeds your soybean fields, all of it sits inside the outcome of this negotiation. The U.S. agricultural sector has already told the USTR, on the public record, that it cannot afford a prolonged trade war with its two largest export markets. And for citizens on either side of the border, there is a deeper democratic stake. The CUSMA architecture, 6-year reviews, rolling annual checkpoints, Section 232 carve-outs, Section 122 caps, is the new template for how trade between democracies will be governed. If it breaks here, between two of the most economically integrated countries on Earth, that has implications that go far beyond North America. The question for every citizen watching this unfold is straightforward. When your government tells you it's holding out for a better deal, what evidence are you using to judge whether that's true? Watch the data. Watch the legal rulings. Watch who sits down at which table, and when. The story isn't that Mark Carney is refusing to make a deal with Donald Trump. The story is that Carney has read the structural board, the sunset clause, the Supreme Court rulings, the failed deals other countries already signed, the leverage embedded in Canadian energy and minerals, the political weather of an approaching American midterm, and concluded that patience is the strongest position he holds. He may be wrong. Strategic patience requires the discipline to absorb real, ongoing damage on the bet that the structural picture pays out. It requires a population willing to wait, and it requires a counterparty across the table who, eventually, has reasons of his own to deal. The next 90 days will tell us whether the bet was correct. Watch July 1st. Watch the June 1st USTR report. Watch whether Carney and Trump finally meet. Those are the events that will tip this one direction or the other. The news give you events. We try to give you the architecture behind them. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, subscribe, leave the word leverage in the comments so I know who actually made it to the end, and we'll see you in the next briefing. Stay sharp.